Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And it's time for another worst to best ranking. So two worst to best rankings in a row. Needless to say, this wasn't a video I was planning to do around now. Before I started my next discography review, I was actually planning to do a Redux review for one album I covered early on in my channel's life and felt like I didn't properly do justice. But then, well, we lost another legend. And maybe the biggest loss for electronic music that I can even remember. Just a few days ago, it was announced that Florian Schneider, one of Kraftwerk's founding members, passed away from cancer at age 73. And you know, I did tribute videos to Robert Miles and Keith Flint when they died, but this was a much bigger deal in my eyes because, let's be real, electronic music would not be a thing without Kraftwerk. They're basically the single most influential name in the genre, bar none. Nearly everyone you can think of, both in this genre and even lots of people outside of the genre, have followed formulas or been inspired by some way by what this band started in the 70s. And most of their work still holds up really well to this day. Hell, Kraftwerk were even one of my own first exposures to electronic music and led me to become as obsessed with the genre as I am. The only other names I was into before them were Orbital and Air, and that was it. Even if I am still just in my 20s and obviously wasn't there to see any of their releases as they were happening, they're still a massive part of my childhood. And even if Florian left the band in 2008, a few years after their final studio album, and I still stand by my statements that it's absolutely for the best that no new music has been released under the Kraftwerk name since, I'm still kinda iffy on the existence of 3D the catalog. Hearing news of Florian's passing completely threw me off and took the wind out of my sails, completely killed my motivation to do anything the rest of that day, and still took a while for me to want to do something for this channel and get back to business. I knew I absolutely had to make my next video a Kraftwerk tribute of some kind. But of course, it was a little harder this time because I've already done in-depth reviews on the rest of the Kraftwerk discography back in 2017. Only video left to do for these guys to fully exhaust the topic was the worst to best ranking. So here we are. I guess let's get into the disclaimers. First of all, this ranking only concerns their 10 original studio albums. That includes the early pre-Autobahn experimental work, but it does not include the Mix, Minimum Maximum, or 3D the catalog, as the former is more like a self-remix album that just provides new versions of their old tracks, and the latter two are live albums. The Mix and Minimum Maximum are definitely worth checking out though, and several versions from those projects I'm even more used to listening to than the original versions. I would even go so far as to say that if you've never heard any Kraftwerk before, I would recommend starting with Minimum Maximum. Really helps me fall in love with them and still holds up on a personal level at least. And 3D the catalog, I guess, is an interesting curiosity that occasionally improves upon the originals and other times doesn't. But yeah, those don't count in this lineup. Just the original albums. And of course, as per usual, this is just my opinion and you can feel free to disagree with it. I'm only ranking it based on my own personal enjoyment, which is influenced both by respect for historical impact and pure middle school nostalgia. It's obviously not ranked by influence. Almost all of these guys' projects were super forward-thinking and way ahead of their time. It kind of just goes without saying. Sticking with the most overtly subjective of rankings here. Not that it's even possible to critique art objectively to begin with, but yeah. This list isn't the be-all and end-all. I may even disagree with it myself later, so, you know, all worth keeping in mind. But yeah, let's get into it. This is Kraftwerk, worst to best. At number 10, I have Kraftwerk, self-titled. You know, while I imagine everyone here is going to have very different rankings from my own and won't be able to agree on which projects mean the most to them or whatever other metrics they want to go by, I don't think there's going to be many people out there who don't have the same bottom two picks that I have. The first two Kraftwerk albums show them still in prototype form while not really having formed their identity yet. This particular project not showing the synth pioneers we know and love, but rather a noisy and meandering experimental krautrock project that sometimes has synths, but it's kind of tedious to get through. There are creative ideas here and there, and musical passages I enjoy. I do think its opener Rookzook is pretty decent, and especially like Florian's flute riffs in the beginning. But much of it just isn't very fun to listen to, just too out there and not feeling musical enough. Also, the 4 tracks here just kind of meander all over the place without feeling like they have much purpose. Sure, it came out in 1970, back in the days when electronic music was still relegated to academia and hadn't really proven itself to be something that could be accessible to a wider audience. In that way, it's still excusable and makes sense in context, but this still doesn't deliver much of what I've always seen to be Kraftwerk's core appeal. It feels like a totally different band made it. They've always seemed wary about associating with this one in more recent decades, and yeah, I can kinda see why. At number 9, I have Kraftwerk 2. This project gets ranked higher entirely because of its 17-minute multi-part opener Kling Klang, a track that does actually deliver on the core appeal and original sound you typically associate with Kraftwerk. Even if the tunes aren't particularly memorable, they still sound gorgeous and use their more minimalistic approach to their advantage. Shame nothing else on the album comes even close to that quality. The second half of this project is much less interesting and even harder to get into than the stuff on their debut. There's one okay track called Strum that does try to build into an actual song, but there's also 2 overlong meandering guitar pieces that go nowhere, a closing track of very slow individual harmonica notes, and worst of all, a 3-minute cut of slowed down breathing noises. Not really sure why anyone would want to listen to something like that. This project shows their first step in the right direction and moving towards the sound of Kraftwerk we know and love, and even doing so without using any synthesizers yet, just live instrumentation and tape manipulation. Like the debut, it's interesting as a curiosity, but also you wouldn't be missing too much if you just skipped out on it. At number 8, I have Radioactivity. Alright, now we're really getting into the good stuff. This is only ranked so low because, like the 2 self-titled albums, it's not one of their more musical-sounding projects, and none of the actual tunes here are among my absolute favorites. But at least in the case of this project, everything serves a very clear purpose and comes together in a clear concept that's both about radioactivity as in the radiation, and radioactivity as in activity on the radio. And as weird as it can get, they keep bringing in creative ideas that all directly tie into this concept. And the proper songs are still really good. The title track, Airwaves, Antenna, Om Sweet Om, even if they have higher points on other albums, these still always stuck with me. Radioland could be a little off-putting for me sometimes, but I can get into it if I'm in the right mood. The whole thing has a definite feel to it that can only be associated with it. Most notably through its use of the Vaco Orchestron keyboard, which made all those harsh fake choirs and strings and gave it a really old-timey feel that could transport you into the 1940s. Also some of their first uses of the vocoder. There's really nothing else out there like it. If you copy ideas off of it, it'll always be really obvious. Even if you're OMD and making Dazzle Ships, which is basically their own slightly more musical take on some similar concepts. It's really damn obvious where their inspiration lay. That album's really good too, by the way, worth looking up. But yeah, this project, like most of their other projects, is a really ahead of its time, forward-thinking classic, and an iconic set of tracks. I just happen to think they have 7 other projects that I personally enjoy more. Whoopsh. At number 7, I have Ralph and Florian. While I get why Kraftwerk were wary about associating with their first 2 projects, this third one is miles better than those, and I really wish it were better recognized by the band themselves. It's early Kraftwerk without really having a concept to tie everything together, but the 6 pieces here are all really creative and musical and interesting and striking and easy to come back to and revisit. Lots of gorgeous melodic passages all around and more subtle ambient passages as well. Just listen to the beautiful and haunting plinky keyboards of Crystallo, or the warm and nostalgic pianos of Heimatklinge, or the lighthearted and uplifting Tunts music. This project is undoubtedly one of the most underrated spots in their catalog. I kinda wanted to put it in the top half just because it gets so overlooked, but I also felt the remaining 6 just hit me on a deeper level. Whoopsh. And number 6, I have Trans Europe Express. You know a band has a solid catalog when a classic like Trans Europe Express technically shows up in the bottom half. It's honestly kinda shrunk on me since back when I first did my series, not one I come back to as often outside of a few isolated moments. Most notably these days I just listen to Europe Endless and that's it. Even the title track I tend to be more in the mood to hear later reworked versions like those on the mix. But that doesn't stop it from being a great freaking album. Despite being entirely made out of synths, this project sounds ancient. It's very haunting and antiquated entirely by design, like a more musical but less conceptual counterpart to Radioactivity. Probably does an even better job of creeping me out than that one as well, especially when I was a kid hearing it for the first time. And I can't say this project has any bad moments either. I mean, I may not love the Hall of Mirrors, Showroom Dummies, or Franz Schubert. They do still add a lot to the project's atmosphere, and they held up well on my most recent listen. And like I said, it'll always have Europe Endless. When I first heard about Florian's passing, that was immediately the first track I went to, and it wrecked me. Well, at this point, I think I more respect its place in history than get a ton of personal enjoyment out of it. It has a lot of nostalgia for me as well. And there may be other projects of theirs I hold closer to me, but Trans Europe Express will always feel like a part of me to some extent. And speaking of projects that will always feel like a part of me, whoosh. And number 5, I have Electric Cafe.
Synthetic electronic sounds, industrial rhythms.
Electric Cafe, aka Technopop, isn't often seen as a big highlight in the Kraftwerk catalog because it's not nearly as forward-thinking as most of their other projects. By 1986, the 80s had caught up to them and they weren't really the future of music anymore. That in itself has made it hold up not as well in some people's minds, and the main reason why it's not even higher in the ranking. I feel like the people who were there to see their output in the 70s would have this closer to the bottom than I do. But I guess that's where my age comes into play, because this was one of the first Kraftwerk albums I ever got into myself. And it has a lot stronger of a nostalgia factor for me than many of their other projects do. It may adhere to a sound palette which is very recognizably mid-late 80s, but it still has a weird avant-garde flair to it that keeps it from feeling too dated. The meandering strangeness combined with their pop-beer leanings on tracks like Techno-Pop, Music Non-Stop, and The Telephone Call was always a ton of fun for me as a kid, and still hold up just as well. It's also much better produced than a lot of the stuff they put out pre-Man Machine. It may not be everyone's cup of tea, but this is definitely a part of my childhood in a way only other projects higher up in the ranking are. Great stuff. Don't overlook it. At number 4, I have Autobahn. This is the project that hit the most differently after hearing that Florian was gone. I might not have held it up as highly back in 2017, but its warmer and more nostalgic tones made it hit really hard now. Of course, we all know the ever-iconic title track and its warm and sunny tones and long meandering passages with lots of Florian's flute riffs interspersed throughout. It's one of the all-time standards of electronic music, probably the first track most people think of when they think of Kraftwerk. But the creepy and mysterious tones of Kometen Melodie 1 and Mitternacht, the burst of pure electronic joy that is Kometen Melodie 2, and the nostalgic and emotional pastoral synth soundscape of Morgen Spaziergang, all of it held up way better than I remembered. Especially the latter. I never liked that closer much before, but it really got to me this time. This project is a giant journey next to 4 mood pieces which are all excellent at what they're trying to do, and anyone who says electronic music has no emotion, really out to listen to this album. Whoosh. At number 3, I have Computer World. I think this one's mainly as high as it is because it's easily the Kraftwerk album I have the most respect for. This album is basically the single most influential album in electronic music history, the beginning of formulas that were turned into techno and industrial and EBM and so much more. it may as well have just spontaneously created the 80s without actually sounding like a product of its time either. It still sounds good by today's standards. Not to mention, it was one of my first albums to hear from them overall. Numbers and Pocket Calculator were such early favorites that bring me way back to my middle school days, and of course Computer Love is probably my single favorite track from them overall. And Home Computer as well. All those cascades of bleeping created such a weird but compelling atmosphere that I can't help but love. And the overarching concept about a world entirely run by computers, it totally came true. Which is both a plus and a minus. A minus because it definitely dates the project finding something so exciting and futuristic in something that is now relatively mundane. But a plus because of how spot on their prediction turned out to be. Beamed themselves into the future, as it were. Now, admittedly, is not a project I put on super often these days. I have started to feel a little more distant from it, but it is also one that I absolutely have to digest all in order. I may have clear favorites from it, but none of these tracks work quite as well when I just take them out of context. I don't know, I suppose it says something when this is one of my most personally overplayed albums ever, especially as a kid, but it still holds up for me to this day, roughly on the same level as it did back then. It's iconic, to say the very least. And number 2, I have Tour de France soundtracks. I don't imagine there's a lot of people who will agree with this project being this high on the ranking, but it is ranked based on my own enjoyment and nostalgia and all that, and Tour de France was a very early favorite of mine that still holds up just as strongly as it did when I was little. Maybe not as forward-thinking as the earlier stuff, but it follows all the hallmarks of Kraftwerk sounds and does it all great. Following a fairly standard minimal techno sound but applying it to their pop sensibilities and interesting conceptual ideas. A whole album about cycling with tracks about nutrition and aerodynamics and staying in shape and the like, delivered by auto-generated voices speaking in French. Why not? All the tracks hold up, have great tunes, consistently fantastic danceable grooves that utilize their more minimalistic leanings for some sleek and shiny atmosphere that can be quite cold but still very appealing in that way. As their final album, I think this was an excellent swan song for the band, and the best version of the Tour de France single closing out this project and being the last track on their last album. What a way to go out on top. But that leaves my actual favorite project from these guys, which may be kind of predictable, but it is what it is. And number 1, I have The Man Machine. I'm still astonished to this day that an album from 1978 still sounds like it came from the future even now. No album better describes the appeal of Kraftwerk in my eyes than this one, delivering sound design that was way ahead of its time but still holds up without feeling like it's aged a day, applying it to a strange concept about cybernetics and robots, but also delivering lots of great catchy tunes. And with only 6 tracks and no room for error, they don't have a single weak point. Iconic Kraftwerk classics like The Robots and The Model, the best versions of both of those, the futuristic and propulsive soundscapes of Space Lab and Metropolis, the menacing tones of the title track, and of course the alien but still warm and emotive Neon Lights. Another track that kind of wrecked me coming back to it now. As far as the synth pop project goes, The Man Machine is practically flawless, and any misgivings I may have with it may just be a product of having played it too much over the years. It's absolutely iconic. It's a big part of my life too. It's an obvious choice for top spot, maybe, but it couldn't have been anything else. It's the freaking Man Machine. And yeah, that's the ranking. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me a review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.